Next, we're going to look at sentence structure. So in English, there are 4 functional categories of sentences. We can classify them into declarative, interrogative, imperative, and exclamatory. Now let's start with the last one, exclamatory. We already looked at the interjection as a part of speech, and that goes along with an exclamatory sentence. It expresses strong emotion. We're not going to use those in scientific writing. So back to the top, a declarative sentence is a sentence that makes a statement. It declares something. An interrogative sentence asks a question, right? It's interrogating the reader in a way. You could think of it that way. It's going to ask a question. And an imperative sentence is going to give a command. It's going to make a request, or it's going to give instructions. So which of these sentences do you think is going to be the most common in scientific writing? I hope you said declarative. So a declarative sentence is going to definitely be the most common type of sentence in scientific writing. Occasionally you might see an interrogative sentence, a question sentence. And maybe in materials and methods or some scientific writing you might give some instructions. But that's going to be not very often either. So declarative sentences are going to make up the vast majority of sentences in scientific writing. So what is a sentence anyway? How do we define a sentence? Well, first it must have a subject. The subject is what the sentence is about. It is the person, place, thing, or idea. In other words, it contains a noun. It can be a single word, it can be a single word noun, or it can be a phrase. Another thing that a sentence must have is it must have what we call a predicate. So there's a subject and a predicate. Now the predicate has to have a verb. As we mentioned when we talked about the parts of speech, you have to have a verb to have a sentence. So the verb is what the person, place, thing, or idea is doing, or its condition. And so the predicate describes all of that, and it includes the verb. The third thing about a sentence is it must be a complete thought. It must have a complete thought or a complete idea, or it's not a complete sentence. It's a partial sentence. And we'll talk about partial sentences later. And one thing that's really important to remember is that in English, the subject comes before the verb. The subject comes first, and then the predicate, and the verb is inside that predicate. Now, when we have certain types of questions, this is reversed. The verb might come before the subject. But in declarative sentences, which are, again, the vast majority of the sentences you will write for scientific writing, the subject comes first, the verb comes after the subject. Let's look at some examples of sentences. And we'll look at the subject, which is in red, and the predicate, which is in italics that are underlined. And then the verb is in blue. So this first sentence says, a supplemental nutrient solution was added daily to maintain proper plant nutrition. The subject is a supplemental nutrient solution. That's what the sentence is about. It's about a supplemental nutrient solution. The predicate is all the rest of the sentence. Was added daily to maintain proper plant nutrition. The verb in that predicate is was added. Second example, soybean is an agronomically important crop. The subject is soybean. The predicate is an agronomically important crop. The verb there is a state of being verb. It's is. Okay, so soybean is an agronomically important crop. That's a full sentence. It has the subject, it has a predicate, and it's a complete thought. Even though it's short, it's a complete sentence. Okay, next, recent advantages in targeted genome sequencing are revolutionizing biological research. So the subject is recent advances in targeted genome sequencing. And this is another state of being, verb, are, and then you see the rest of the sentence is included in that predicate. And then a final example says, recent advances enable mRNA-seq analysis of individual cells. Now this one is a little bit different than the third example because they don't specify what kind of recent advances. But recent advances is the subject of the sentence again. And enable is the verb. So this is an action verb. And the predicate is enable mRNA-seq analysis of individual cells. Let's continue talking about what makes a sentence. And we're going to have a couple more vocabulary terms for you here. The first is a phrase. A phrase is a group of words that act as a part of a sentence, but it does not have a subject and verb. Whereas a clause is a group of words that's part of a sentence that contain a subject and a verb. So a clause has both a subject and a verb, whereas a phrase does not have both a subject and a verb. It might have some nouns, it might have a verb, but it doesn't have both a subject and a verb. Now, a type of clause called an independent clause is required in a sentence. An independent clause is a clause that can stand on its own as a sentence. A complete sentence must include an independent clause, and an independent clause might be a complete sentence, or it might just be part of a sentence. This will make a little bit more sense with some examples. A supplemental nutrient solution was added daily to maintain proper plant nutrition. If we just said a supplemental nutrient solution was added, that's a complete sentence. Right? It has the subject, it has the predicate, including the verb, and then the rest of the sentence is additional information. It's telling when the solution was added and why it was added. That's additional information, but it's not necessary to have a complete thought. I mean, the sentence is better with that information, but it's complete without the information. So the independent clause is highlighted in blue there. A supplemental nutrient solution was added. The second example, soybean is an agronomically important crop. That's the independent clause, and it's the entire sentence. So there's no additional information in this sentence, which is fine. It's not a problem. A third example, we searched the literature for distribution checklists and used personal contacts to collect data sets of Lepidoptera on true islands. So there's actually two independent clauses in this sentence. The first one is we searched the literature. That could be a complete sentence, but there's more information in the sentence. There's also a second independent clause there, and is sharing the subject with the first independent clause, we. We used personal contacts. That could be a complete sentence also. But you see that there are some phrases that add information to those independent clauses. For distribution checklists, then there's a conjunction to connect ideas. We used personal contacts to collect data sets of Lepidoptera on true islands. So 3 phrases of additional information for that second independent clause. All right, so we have talked about an independent clause. You might have guessed that with the term independent clause, there's probably also a term for a dependent clause, and that is true. So what is a dependent clause? It is a clause, so it has a subject and a verb, and it's part of a sentence, but it is not a complete thought on its own. So it cannot be a complete sentence by itself. It's dependent on the independent clause that's in the sentence. So let's look at some examples of dependent clauses. So we have the independent clause marked in blue, the dependent clause marked in red. We designate a state as the system end node of the whole network for the purpose of collecting tokens after the last observation is processed. So the red part is a clause. It has a subject, it has a verb. Secondly, the potential of treatments included in this study is consistent with previously reported potentials where similar designs, size classifications, and study methods were used. Again, the red part has a subject. It's that long phrase there. And were used is the verb, but it's not a complete thought. That clause depends on the first clause, the independent clause, to make a complete thought. So therefore it's a part of a sentence, but it's not able to stand on its own. This third example has the dependent clause coming first before the independent clause. You'll see that sometimes. To assess the proportion of cells in which treatment with Cas9 expressing baculovirus resulted in loss of protein, prometaphase cells were analyzed by immunofluorescence microscopy. And the fourth example is, we must create transition links to all the HMMs that immediately follow the first HMM after the model internal transition links are created. Now we can put together independent clauses and dependent clauses in ways that make different types of sentences. So let's look at 4 different types of sentences. There is a simple sentence where there is one independent clause, and then when you have 2 or more independent clauses, you have a compound sentence. And these are typically joined by a conjunction like and or but. So compound has 2 or more independent clauses, whereas a complex sentence has 1 independent clause and 1 or more dependent clauses. So that last slide we just looked at had 4 examples of complex sentences. Then you can also have a compound complex sentence where you have 2 or more independent clauses. That's what makes it compound. And you have 1 or more dependent clauses. That's what makes it complex. Now, I would advise you against writing compound complex sentences in your scientific writing. It's just too hard for the readers to follow that and parse all of the different elements. I would suggest that you mostly write simple sentences and then occasionally throw in a compound sentence or a complex sentence. It's okay to have those. If you have entirely simple sentences, it's going to get a little bit boring for the readers. If you have entirely compound and complex sentences, it's going to make your readers tired because it's a lot more work for them. So use a mixture of different sentence types of these first 3 types, mostly simple, some compound, some complex.